Welcome to Fintech Townsquare. I'm your host Nihit. Joining us today is Niki Luhur. He is the CEO of Vida, a startup that's focused on making digital identity verification easy and secure. They offer services like digital IDs, digital signatures, and passwordless authentication that your digital transactions are both safe and recognized by law. Niki has a rich background in fintech, serving as the co-founder of the Indonesia Fintech Association and holding leadership roles at Kartuku, a payments technology company. In our conversation today, we are going to discuss various aspects of building financial services product. We'll explore how Vida manages to keep user experience high while prioritizing security and the thought process that goes behind into choosing between building or partnering. We'll get insights into how Vida found its product market fit and the ways Niki fosters trust and collaboration in a remote working setup. We'll also talk about the unique challenges of making decisions in a startup environment and how Niki approaches that. And finally, we'll hear from him about his personal growth journey, his advice for people who are seeking for mentorship, and the book recommendations for all of us here. So let's get started with the conversation. Thanks, Nikki, for speaking to us. Thank you for spending this time. Really appreciate this. When we talk about fintech or financial services, a lot of times we want to think about building a lending product or a payments product or insurance product. What you are doing around authentication, digital signature is very less known. People don't think about that organically. And even when you talk about emerging markets, it's such a hard problem. The data pipes don't exist. You are dependent on the clients. The government has got very strict norms with you as well. How did you have the courage and the insight to build something so difficult in a market which is so hard?
Well, I mean, the reality is that Vida is probably, was only born out of the culmination of all of my experience prior. In my first startup at Kartuku, about 12 years, really focusing on authentication and specifically in the offline piece, a lot of, more complex security was deployed. So, certain iterations, I'd say, of public key infrastructure and a lot of areas. And the reality is, if I like to really deduce what we did at Kartuku, payments is easy. Payments is just a credit or a debit. It's a journal. That's it. It's double accounting. You're done. That's the actual payment. The hard part about payments is actually making sure it runs securely. And it's really about information security. And at the end of the day, what is authentication? Is authentication just trying to prove you are who you say you are. And when I looked at some of the newer emerging issues and problems, and frankly, not all of it was intentional. A lot of it came from the next chapter was really about leading the Fintech Association. And frankly, it was the core motivation of building out the Fintech Association was just give back to the community as I was planning to exit from Kartuku or at least move on. It definitely felt like that was a significant chapter and wanted to make sure that I, had a chance to give back. And where I thought there was the most value in giving back was frankly fixing the really hard problems that I had faced that I felt I never had time for and nobody else made time for. And a lot of that came down to regulations and working together with the government and provide constructive feedback on policy and to actually pool together everyone's voice so that there aren't 300 voices. There's one concise voice with very clear advice and very objective research to back it up. Actually, that's where a common charter was born for the industry. And we kind of said, okay, well, we can't solve 100 problems and we can't have 100 voices. If we want to be effective, we need to prioritize. And when it came down to is we ran a simple survey, and the number one pain point in the whole industry unanimously was KYC and the need to actually have to have a face-to-face interaction with somebody to prove their identity. And frankly, the number two problem and challenge was a wet signature. So, and for obvious reasons, right? So, as digital of an experience, as great as your digital marketing campaign, as great as your customer acquisition sort of strategy is, if you need to have a face-to-face interaction or somebody has to print, wet sign, and courier you documents, it just kills the entire conversion. It kills it. And I think it was fairly obvious frankly, the motivation for everyone to band together to put these other priorities were clear. I think the challenge was a lot of the devil in the details on the regulations and being able to realize that this was complicated because there are multiple regulatory bodies involved. There's uh, the Ministry of ICT, Cominfo. There is the Ministry of Law. There is, of course, the financial regulators. And to scale, in Indonesia, we have the Ministry of Home Affairs has a national ID that is quite advanced with that is biometrically enabled, um, face, finger, iris, and fully deduplicated. Very similar to what you see in India with Aadhaar. So I think this is where the challenge was actually, being able to coordinate between ministries and to harmonize regulations. And there wasn't an issue of, I think everyone saw the vision and agreed of what problem needed to be solved. But that was really the role that the FinTech Association played, or AFTEC, to be able to go into the details, help really fine tune and make sure that each stakeholder had their voice heard and we incorporated it and were able to solve the problem holistically. So, anyways, it was actually these two pieces that collided together. And as a result, the Indonesian regulations really were allowing for third party operators, also known as certificate authorities under Cominfo, to be able to provide this role of providing identity verification, digital signatures, and authentication. And frankly, it came at that crossroad where it all of a sudden made sense that Vida should be born. And even though that the regulatory landscape was there, I mean, that's definitely a starting point. At the end of the day, in regulated businesses, in fintech businesses, you really have to pay attention to the regulations and the details of that regulation. There's so many nuances that come out of there, and I think I definitely recommend every product manager and beyond, actually, anyone who really wants to have a firm grasp of any fintech business, you need to read the regulations yourself and go into it and go and seek advice beyond trying to get your own take. And I think, fortunately enough, while it was a spirit of give back, the irony is I got a lot more out of it by giving back. And it was actually the inspiration to start Vida in its form, and a lot of it again came from former missions around, trying to start with a few ideals of believing in financial inclusion and branchless banking and being able to bring technology to really digitize financial services. And it started with these high level concepts, but over time, just by working on it, and I generally believe, as much as it's good to look at a few different areas, you do need to develop mastery or some level of expertise in a certain area, and it comes down to time. I spent so much time in payments. I think that's where a lot of the information security, the authentication, a lot of areas around personal data protection came naturally as a result of that, and Vida was a natural build off of that. Now I think actually Vida is far more complicated than what Kartuku used to be, but that's a challenge and also a moat, right? And that's, I think, every great business has moats, and moats by definition are hard to get over, right? But that's the beauty in it, right? If you keep focusing on a specific set of problems. And I think at Vida, our mission is really simple. We want to make it easy for you to prove who you are and make it very difficult for others to claim they're you, right? So um, now that statement is simple, sounds easy. It's not easy. And that's where there's complex areas of things like identity verification, portability of your information,
Right.
personal data protection, privacy, authentication, information security. All these aspects collide. And I guess a lot of it as well was, a vision of building digital infrastructure that really is a lot more unified. And I think a lot of those principles, again, came from just past DNA of building payments infrastructure.
Nice. There's so much that you shared, and I was figuring out which layer to pick. I mean, there were so many threads, so many nuggets there. One thing that resonated with me was to make it easy for users to identify who they are. So I think that's the point that you mentioned. And when you think or unpack this, right, there could be sometimes counterintuitive forces in the sense that you might want to make it for the user. It's very seamless, very frictionless, and it's as easy as it gets for them to e-sign them, e-verify them. But there's also the other side where you want to make sure that you're on the right side of the law, you're very accurate. Do you face these challenges when you're building this product, when you're thinking about this, that how do you balance the two, being accurate versus making it extremely, extremely user-centric, users enjoy it, and very frictionless also?
Well, and that's what's typically seen as, you know, an oxymoron, right?
Yes,
So if you make something secure, it's very difficult to use, or if you make something very easy to use, you sacrifice security.
correct.
These have always been seen as polar opposites,
Hmm.
and I think when you work in the space long enough, and you work long enough in security, I think the challenge is, you'll have a good set of tools. But ultimately, I think for every product manager or anyone who's building a product, you never can lose sight of what problem are you solving.
Hmm.
And the problem of usability is number one, because if you make a product so secure but nobody uses it, well, what's the point? And and I think that in lies the challenge of great design.
Hmm.
It's not trading one for the other. And and that's where it does take a certain level of patience and expertise to figure that out. And I think part of it is also that it's not one size fits all.
Hmm.
I think you have to really look at the specific use cases.
Hmm.
If you're looking at a use case around onboarding and opening an account, there generally is not going to be that much fraud immediately, right? I mean, there are some edge cases, there are reasons why people do that
Sure.
for fraud, but generally, where fraud happens is where people can steal value and steal money.
Hmm.
So, if you look at where it is specifically on the different user journeys, you'll start to realize it's not a one size fits all approach. And each user journey, you can classify a different level of risk. And with that, be more informed about, well, if that's the business risk tolerance levels and what is the objective? If the objective is we need to fulfill our compliance, of course, right? But beyond that, what is the amount of risk for opening an account? Now, opening an account versus signing a loan and then dispersing funds,
Hmm.
very different levels of risk. And I think that's where, having a more granular understanding and then approaching those situations differently
Hmm.
is really critical. I think the difference of how we tackle things at Vida is we do start from a very strong first basis, and that's really going through full blown identity proofing. We're talking about biometric authentication, demographic verification, checking to national ID databases and authoritative sources, deploying actual electronic certificates which have public key infrastructure in them. That's already quite complex, and in fact, that's probably one of the heavy first lifts at Vida that is a bit unusual, and why I'd say Vida is more akin to an infrastructure business than it is,
Hmm.
a financial services business. Um, and that's, I think that first lift is heavy, but if you get it right and you make it scalable enough, in fact, the fact that you already did really strong identity proofing upfront, and there are standards to define this. There are global standards such as identity assurance levels, authentication assurance levels. So these are not necessarily subjective. Right? You have different standards to follow. You're able to sort of look at that, and for us was how do we carry over this throughout an entire customer journey? That it will be able to think about how do we resolve onboarding not just once, but what it's typically done in multiple different parts of that customer journey and simplify it, make it a simple onboarding experience, while at the same time making sure that privacy, consent, compliance, all of those aspects are thought through. And then, of course, making sure for the businesses as well that we help solve their business objectives. And a lot of it is actually going to be similar to what the user wants. And the more frictionless that user experience, the higher the conversions and
Hmm.
the happier the customer and the happier the business because they get to actually do the transaction they intended on doing. And it's not, because of some context switch, some platform switch, or too many steps, too many clicks that people give up. So for me, I think when you think about some of these challenges, it has to start with what's the business objective? It has to start with what are the problems you're solving? And use the technology and tools and think creatively with these tools to solve the problem and not the other way around. Right. So I think that's, always the easiest way is just think in terms of use case one at a time,
Right.
not everything under the sun all at once.
Oh, beautiful. I mean, what I inferred from what you said, and the way I would paraphrase is that rather than thinking about onboarding and privacy and risk at a high level, maybe follow a sort of decision tree wherein you calculate the probability of any each event happening, and you decide that wherein you can take a risk that should it be more frictionless, or is it an area where somebody might want to fraud you. So in opening an account and onboarding flow might not be an area where you would see a lot of risk, but the value to create a frictionless experience is huge if you can make some, and the business will drive a lot of value from that. So make that, if you have to err between frictionless versus risk, you probably err on the side of making it frictionless when you're opening an account. But when you're trying to do a transaction, taking money out, that's when you take a different hat altogether, and we try to make sure that you are foolproof and fraud proof. So,
Exactly. And I think what you can also look at and what we try and help is helping our clients think about this as a journey. So you don't have to do everything all at once. When you do the identity proofing well and you end up and leverage our initial launch with an electronic certificate or public key infrastructure or digital ID, whatever you like to call it, actually we start creating one very strong factor of authentication and beyond just biometrics. I think that's where when we want to start tackling fraud, when we want to start tackling things like account takeovers, which basically come from two vector, right?
hmm,
It's credential recovery or password reset, right? And new device enrollment. If you think about what is the solution is let's make sure that we're not just sending an SMS OTP that can be hijacked, phished, socially engineered. Let's just trigger the same identity proofing process that we did in the first place.
hmm,
Let's make sure that this isn't a proxy of a user's ID, but actually them. And all you have to do is just challenge the same process that was used, the same identity verification process that was used for KYC.
hmm,
Use that same process, and you're going to eliminate the vast majority of your fraud. If you want to step it up even further, being able to leverage the infrastructure that you have around these key infrastructure, and then being able to then create things like a trusted device and proxies of your identity and start chaining trust from that real world ID to now, okay, now I know this is a trusted device. And no more complicated than even how it works with Android or iOS, right? If you log into Gmail on a new browser, on a new device, on your friend's laptop,
hmm,
colleague's laptop, you're going to have a push to your phone. And it's going to say, hey, is this you? And you
right.
simply click, yep, it's me. And it should be that simple. And that's the thing is to get it that simple, you do need to have the skills in authentication. You need to understand how the security works. But at the same time, you know, being able to know how the user interaction, how that user journey is where it needs to start.
Hmm,
And that's what we do with Vida. It's like, okay, let's build the next layer at the right time and deliver the next piece of the solution step by step. And over time, you're going to have multiple layers of security built. And the reality is, good security isn't about building the most impenetrable wall, right? There's no such thing. It will break. Any single thing will break at some point in time. It's about designing multiple layers. It's about designing, what's called defense in depth, right? And all it means is there's just different layers, different approaches that make it the same way that a castle is. It's not just the moat.
hmm,
There's the outer wall, there's the inner walls, there's turrets, there's guards. There's a whole entire construct that makes it difficult for you to attack because you have to be able to attack in multiple different ways. I think this is where just drawing that analogy of a castle and a castle's design, that's how you need to think about security, right? No single vector is going to be perfect, right? Like face recognition, as much as it's been great and there's been massive improvements, and even liveness detection, there's so much progress in the industry. There is still going to be a lot of evolution required, and that's the
Hmm.
nature of everything AI or machine learning driven. It's going to have a certain level of cat and mouse, if you will.
Right.
But blending those sorts of discipline with sort of old school, tried and true cryptography, which actually is not probabilistic, it is deterministic, and having these very different disciplines mashed together is challenging to do. But at the same time, we believe that's the value we create. So I think when building a product, it's also doing something that is novel and unique, right? I think what we clearly decided we're not going to do is, we're not going to build a document management platform like DocuSign. It's already a great product. We just partner.
Hmm.
We're happy to work together with the ecosystem. We don't need to build what's already been built. I think for us, it's let's solve the challenge and the problem that still hasn't been solved, and
Hmm.
let's focus on that. And we can partner with other people to actually make the entire solution more holistic and more compelling for our clients and their customers and their end users. You can't solve everything yourself.
Right. And that's a great segue. So one of the things that in fintech industry, like we partner with you, you help us with a lot of re-signing, authentication, verification. It's also maybe reflective of emerging market that we need to partner with a lot of people to kind of get things done. And as a CEO, you might have to face this choice probably every second day, that do you partner versus do you build? And I think one framework that you talked about is that you want to see if the solution already exists or not, if it exists well enough or not, and that's how you decide. Is there more to it? Is there more to unpack when Niki looks at a decision and evaluates, should we partner versus should we build?
So I think the biggest question of partner versus build first has to start with understanding your own identity of who you are as a company and who you are as a group of individuals and what you value you can create that hopefully no one else can do, right? What are the things that you're uniquely positioned to create value for? And I always start with those principles first. And I think the second is, especially in fintech, knowing that it, businesses are heavily regulated. That's also another very big driver of where the walls will be. What is the definition of your vertical? Where do you fall within a life, sort of context? And I think with more of those, that gives you a bit easier way to filter out. But I think last but not least, it's which part do you have to build now, and what could potentially be later. And I think that those aspects, right, being able to, especially if there's different technology skills and competencies that are needed, you can't pick all the battles at the same time, right? You have to sort of sequence it. So I would say those are the different reasons. And sometimes the last one is there a good partner? Is there
Hmm.
a good partner out there that can fulfill your needs? And if there is, great, because then you can focus on something else. Because usually, I think the challenge in Southeast Asia, it's going really deep in one specific area may not be the right solution. Being able to provide more of an end-to-end user
Hmm.
experience and journey is often more valuable for the customer. It depends on the nature of your business. I think for us, we are niche
Hmm.
in terms of identity verification and authentication, but at the same time, we actually have quite a bit of breadth that we cover in our specific space. So there is depth and breadth, but in a specific area. And that's where I think being able to hone that balance that makes sense, that and as one product line for us, it's even though we have identity verification, you know, uh, digital IDs, digital signatures, authentication. We have all these solutions. Each one of these products is in a single go-to-market motion. So I think that's the next thing to really think about. Oftentimes, we think about products in terms of technology, and it's one of the, I would say, the common challenge about how you design and build a product is that makers often focus on the shiny object, you know, the product they're building, and forget about the rest of the entire journey and what it takes to deliver to the customer.
Right.
I think when you really think about that entire customer journey and what's expected and what's needed, it tends to be clearer where you're going to be able to add value and where potentially somebody else can do a better job. And then when you can work together with other stakeholders to create that seamless journey, I believe that's the real value.
Well, this is super layered and super useful, Nikki. Maybe for the audience who are probably want some more vivid examples, something that they can relate to. When you talk about partnerships and when you talk about building your niche, and when you also make sure that we have enough bread coming in, one of the challenges that product managers face every time is resource constraint or prioritization. So these two things are again very handy, right? So for example, we don't have resources, so should we partner versus should we build? Is there an example that you can think of in last 6 8 months where you had to face that decision, and how did that journey go? This might also help our audience to relate well in terms of how Nikki operates and how he takes decision on a real life basis.
You know, for us, I mean, resource constraints are the name of every startup, right? And frankly, it's necessity is the mother of all invention, right?
Right.
So I think that is something to be help us actually understand our focus and where our real value needs to lie. Again, I'll come back to the customer journey.
Mhm.
So the way we look at it is where a lot of our market and what people are asking us for are to help them with eKYC, with
Mm.
onboarding, with digital signatures. And the way we see it is, okay, that's the first step into this along this journey. And of course, if that's the first step, we need to make sure that, you know, the maturity of that product cycle is going to need to be ahead of everything else. And that if that's the entry point, and authentication only happens when you're doing transactions, when you want to sign a document, when you want to, you know, initiate a payment, when you want to withdraw funds from an account, you want to transfer funds, then that comes later in the journey. And being able to understand the nuances of these different time frames also is really important. And not just in terms of journey, but where you are in your customer adoption cycle, right? As we think about crossing the chasm, are you just with your early adopters? And early adopters and the mainstream market have very different expectations of what your product is going to look like. And, you know, I think Tony Fidel wrote about to build and did a great job of 3 generations, right? Of the V1, V2, V3, and V2 really about crossing the chasm, right? And he
Right.
did a brilliant job of taking Jeffrey Moore's Crossing the Chasm and overlaying different generations of product according to that level of market adoption. So I think if you think about both nuances, one from a more product vision, product strategy level, and then as you look at your products actually getting adopted, achieving product market fit, and what's needed, you don't necessarily need to build, you know, the expectations in the earlier days of your V1 is just essentially it's your prototype that is reaching product market fit.
Mm.
You need that to self-serve right away? Probably not. Right. So there are things that we will want to do because I think everyone who, you know, has built these products will want to see something that's going to be fully end to end. But the challenge is this the right time? And I think when it comes to that, it's understanding who are your customers at that point in time and what do they really expect. So that is really quite critical. And perhaps to make that and some of the things that I like to, you know, sort of we've adopted at Vida is this whole write a press release, right? Write a press release in advance. Not you don't have to launch the press release, but show and make that intangible vision tangible,
Mm.
right? Bring that onto a piece of paper that everyone can reference and see, oh, this is the problem we're solving for who, and what do they really need now, and not the 100 reasons to buy. No, nobody wants 100 reasons. What are the 1, 2, 3 reasons? that really matter? What's the one thing that really matters? And I think once you start telling that story, and as long as you continue to have that product narrative as you're building your product, you keep going back and you keep fine tuning this narrative and fine tuning that press release. And over time, based on what really worked, you have a much clearer idea of where to focus. And that's always the hardest thing to
Right.
do.
So actually, one theme that keep coming to me again and again is one, you are phenomenally clear about what Vida is offering and what Vida is not offering. So who you are, what's the Vida identity? That's very very phenomenally clear. Clear. The second part is clear that you know what customer value you are creating, and therefore you want to make sure that you are significantly and leaps and bounds ahead of your competition when you create that specific value. So that's one dimension. The other dimension that keeps coming back is that you have a sort of a framework or a rubric where you defined probabilistically in terms of what is the likelihood of a certain scenario to happen, what is the risk of that scenario to happen. So if a fraud happens, what is the scenario there, if a fraud happens on the onboarding versus fraud happening on money movement side. And when you're putting this together, it looks like there is a lot amount of clarity when you're deciding what to build, when to prioritize, when you think about resource constraints. Is that a fair articulation about how you kind of broadly think about decision making?
I think it's always easier to talk about it in hindsight.
Sure.
And reality, when you're in that 0 to 1, it is going to be a bit messier, right? I mean, let's be honest. But at the same time, I think once you have found it, oftentimes, that product market fit is known and it's intuitively known. It's not explicitly communicated, and it's not explicitly documented. And you may think you understand it really well, but until you can articulate it and get somebody else to articulate it in a similar way, in their own way, but get the same, the same crux of the message, the same essence of the message across, only then do I feel like you actually have scaled up what is the core meaning and that value of the product. So it does take a lot more intentional effort. And I think from our side, sort of realized, second time around, it's you kind of have to invest in writing down your thoughts a lot more than sometimes you may think, and it can be a simple bullet journal, and coming back to that bullet journal week after week, because after a while, I think you'll start to see patterns. And once you start seeing these patterns, you start clustering your ideas and revisiting it and retuning it. It's something that will come over time. That clarity is going to be a mashup of all the different inspiration, and whether it's white papers that you read, great books from other entrepreneurs, conversations with other founders, conversations with other product managers. The stimulus should come from everywhere.
Right.
But I think sometimes the discipline to write it down and
Mm.
intentionally record what you believe is going to be valuable for you in the future, and then having it in one place and taking the time to take a step back periodically to see how you can synthesize that information in a more unique manner is really the challenge and the value that you can create. And that's the creative process, right? It should be a little bit more chaotic. I mean, the stimulus and information should come from a lot of different places, but at the same time, being able to structure your thinking is going to be the difference of whether or not you actually have a vision or you have an idea.
Talking about product market fit, and given the fact that it is so hard to know, like going forward, that have you hit it or not, what's your most vivid memory about your three products that Vida had, and you realize, I think I found a product market fit? Was it a customer talking? Was it you looking at some data points? What do you recollect the most vividly that I think I have achieved the product market fit?
Well, our product market fit required, 4 different regulatory institutions to agree. So that first one is very difficult, and then you have to have the customer also like your product. So in Vida's case, it's quite challenging,
Sure.
but at the same time, I think it really came down to thinking about the first contract and getting it live
Hmm.
and working on it, and I think it really helped that we didn't take on a lot of clients intentionally the
Okay.
first time. We focused on a few. We really focused on who are the clients that we will be able to work together
Hmm.
with and want to work together with us, right?
Nice. Okay.
Want to help us build by really going into the details of the problems and iterating it And we were very upfront about it in the beginning, saying, hey, you know, these are the areas that we know, at least from a regulatory compliance point of view, these things are all sorted out. We have all of these thoughts, well baked. But in terms of the user experience, we're going to need to take a few cycles and work together. And that was immensely valuable to focus on a few customers
Hmm.
that could really give us that feedback and help us think through scaling up our product.
That's super nice. And like you said something about not only that did you shortlist your clients, you also probably got a signal that the clients work with you as well, or they want to work with you as well. Was that a soft signal? Was it something that you were intentional about when you were looking for product market fit?
Oh, 100%. 100%. And I think that is really, sort of defining who is that early adopter
Hmm.
and who really wants to be a part of it, because the benefit they get is they really get a fine-tuned product for what they need,
Right.
but they also understand that this is in beta. This is not a fully mature product. There will be issues.
Hmm.
I think it's really important to strike that balance, and not everyone has that appetite. I think being very explicit, especially on the early days, especially on your beta, is critical to getting that product market fit right. Because usually that segment too is really enthusiastic. They
Right.
really love and they're really passionate about it, and they want to be part of this journey to help create.
Right.
And having the right people working together is what creates a lot of joy, right? And everyone is excited. And when we
Right.
see that product working well, it's as much their success as it is ours, right? And I think that's yeah, a combination of being intentional, of doing a bit of a shortlisting, and frankly getting a bit lucky with who you
Hmm.
have across the table. It's not just a profile of the client. At the end of the day, it's who's really sitting there with you and what inspires them and how
Right.
motivated are they, right? I think that setting those expectations clearly up front is really important.
Nice. One dimension that I can probably feel is that for you, trust and collaboration is something which is fundamental, be it your client, be it your team members. And one big thing that happened 3 years back, just COVID, I think took away a lot of way how we operate with team members because we don't see them. And I could feel that sometimes the social capital erodes as well. So do you think, first of all, that trust and collaboration changed their forms before and after COVID? And how do you think about now? How do you build that trust and collaboration when you don't probably meet your people every day? How do you think about that? How do you make sure that teams behave cohesively without meeting the way you were meeting before COVID?
Yeah, no, I think those are great questions. And for me, being able to form an in-person relationship and have that bond and share personal stories that aren't part of a meeting agenda are critical to building trust.
Hmm.
And it's so much easier to do that in person. It's not impossible to do it online, but it's a lot easier to do it in person. And at the same time, I think as we were forced to, work remote because of COVID, it also made us think a lot more explicitly about what was it that we're looking for in the characteristic of our tribe. Why did people connect with each other?
Hmm. Okay.
And it came down to, for us, around, being a lot more explicit about our values. And I know it sounds like the cheesiest thing, right? That values is this thing on a poster. But when we broke down trust, for us, it came down to three things. It came down to authenticity, empathy, and being logical. And
Hmm.
these are the three elements. And simply put, you're more likely to trust me if you believe I'm being my authentic self. You're more likely to trust me if you feel I understand what you're going through and I understand how you feel. And you're more likely to trust me if I can explain why I'm doing something clearly,
Hmm.
with sound logic. And I think those are the three elements that started as our foundation. And we've kept really focusing on trust, which is also core to our business, core to the
Nice.
identity of our business, especially at Vida, that we just focus on that. And I think over time, we really reinforce this strong foundation, which we didn't really realize what is actually, going to be the basis for a strong level of collaboration and teamwork. For us, it was actually more about who are we as a company and what are the values and what do we believe in. And it just sort of honed in all together quite nicely. So definitely not easy. And especially now, thankfully, not all remote. I think being able to spend the time when you are face to face to connect and not have, you know, everything spelled out in terms of an agenda and a specific timing, and being able to just be a bit more flexible and focus on connecting with each other more is, in fact, I think, extremely invaluable. And nothing can replace that. And once you have that rapport and that relationship and that connection, then I think actually being able to work remotely is, and in this sort of hybrid way, is totally fine, because there are benefits of being able to, work in your own space. And a lot of it is, if you want to do deep work, it's fantastic, right? And sometimes if you want to also triage through a whole agenda of meetings where you know the direction, you don't have to do any of the planning. It's really just hardcore execution. You can also be, a lot more effective there rather than sitting in the car in between one meeting to another in traffic, right? So there are clear advantages, but I think at the same time, when it comes to the creative process of brainstorming, of planning, and the more collaborative work, for us, I think we still believe, if possible, do that in person. There's so much more that comes across.
And would you, in your interview process, evaluate for authenticity somebody's empathy and somebody's ability for logic? I think logic is slightly easier, but do you evaluate for authenticity and empathy in the interview process? Is that something that you are intentional?
100%.
Oh,
100%.
okay, nice.
For us, it's not only the interview process, but also, the reference checks, right? And I think that those two elements are really important. It is the foundation of our culture. Those are areas that we really make no compromises, and it continues to be, as we look at who we want as leaders within Vida, those continue to be the same guidelines. And as we think about reviews, as we think about giving out kudos to people in the, to the team, and who are exemplifying the right, sort of cultures and behaviors, those are the same reference points. So just staying consistent to it, we believe, is what will make it really happen.
I want to move gears and talk about decision making and delegation. And somebody asked Jack Welch long back that, what is the rule to succeed? He said there's just two rules. One is that make your managers work less and make him look good. And if you think about this, these are actually very profound, because as quickly and as beautifully you can look at what your manager is doing, and if you can, find what his KPIs and KRAs are and just solve for that, and you do this well, it can actually, of course, make him look good and he can succeed. And it is also great for you to be successful in that role as well. So when you, as a CEO, work and operate, how do you advise younger managers, younger operators who are working for someone like yourself, CEOs, that how can they make you look good and how can they make their work less? And what things are you okay to delegate versus not?
There's, in terms of delegation and decision making, when it's smaller teams, frankly, you don't need to be as explicit. I think it just happens pretty quickly and rapidly. Everyone kind of knows what everyone else is doing. And as the company starts to grow, things will evolve. And of course, the first is just the functional organization structure, which again tends to work fairly intuitively. I think where you need to be a bit more strategic in thinking about decision making, and where you delegate that decision making, is once it starts coming to a certain scale and size, where you're going to inherently start thinking about pods, or little smaller teams or ninja teams, or whatever you like to call them, making sure that these smaller teams not only have the self-resilience, but the ability to make decisions a lot more independently, is going to be critical. And a lot of the challenge is going to be that this pod, by definition of how it can be more self-sufficient and move faster, it's going to be cross-functional. So once cross-functional elements start to come around, then that level of decision-making needs to be carefully assessed. And I would really look at, Vida, we use rapid decision-making frameworks. That really makes it super clear. But I think the essence of it, there's two parts that are really important, especially when there's a lot of cross-function. Just make it really clear who's responsible. Who's responsible for creating that recommendation? And the simple rule of thumb is, who's doing 80% of the work? Who's doing 80% of the work, right? So, I think that makes it really obvious. But sometimes you'll be surprised how many people think that they're responsible, and then there's two people that believe that they're both responsible. And that should be quickly resolved. And the second is, who's the decision maker, right? And that can only be one person. You can have multiple people that provide input, and you definitely need to have the people who perform the task provide input. That's extremely important as well. But I think at the same time, just simplifying these two pieces first is probably the most critical part in making sure, especially cross-functional decision making happens effectively. I think that's really important. In terms of what to delegate or where to delegate, it really depends, right? And I think the key to first for a leader to decide whether to let go or not, the benchmark is, well, I can still I think I can do that job better. That's definitely one aspect, and hopefully you're delegating to somebody that can definitely do the job better than you can. Then it's a clear no-brainer. But sometimes I think the other question to ask yourself is, what are the things that only you can do? What are the things that you are best at doing? And focusing on the few things that you're really great at, and not trying to do everything. And when you look at it that way, it's actually optimizing your time to be able to focus on only the things that you can do, and to be able to ultimately optimize the level of value and impact you can create. I think it makes it a lot easier to let go, and a lot easier to realize what are the areas that you should delegate and what are the areas you should not. And again, it comes down to assessing what is your core, right? So I think those two aspects help me guide what are the decisions and what should I delegate, what should I not, where should I focus, where should I not. And as I delegate, how do you make sure that the people that we're delegating to are properly empowered, that the decision making happens effectively? Because the whole point is the decision making shouldn't sit with me anymore if we want to make it faster, right? And making sure that we're explicit on, especially on cross functions, how decisions will be made, who's making that recommendation and who's giving an input, and ultimately in who's making that call. Despite the fact that there may be people disagreeing, and you have to have that process where at the end of the day, you're going to disagree. There may be disagreement, but you still commit, even if
Sure.
you're performing the task, right? And that's, I think, really important to state up front and explicitly. And that's really the decision maker's job, to make sure that not only that you take the decision effectively, but to make sure that anyone who disagrees still commits.
Right. And do you think that that whole disagree to commit framework, I think Amazon popularized that, is something that you believe and vouch by, and you feel that that's a good ingredient for a company to succeed?
I think fundamentally in startup, there are so many unknowns.
Right.
And oftentimes, the people who are taking a decision, you may have to shoot from the hip. You may not have all the information, but not making a decision or not working together
Hmm.
once a decision has been made is far worse than making the wrong decision or not making a decision and getting up in analysis paralysis. I think in the end, it's about making sure you move quickly, because that is fundamentally, the competitive advantage of every startup. That's what makes the whole equation different of how you can disrupt. It's speed. So being able to harness that strength and lean into that, knowing that we're optimizing for speed, and we will get things wrong, and that's okay as long as we learn and we have a process to come back and correct our path again, that's fine. Again, it doesn't end up in this sort of analysis paralysis where somebody tries to veto, and then it just undermines the ability to work together as a team.
Got it. Makes sense. Cool. Before we started recording this, I asked a couple of people who look up to you, and if there were questions there. So somebody asked me to ask you that you have started Kartuku and you now moved to Vida. Are there tenets and principles of building and running organizations that remain same, and are there tenets that change when you evolved from driving Kartuku to Vida?
Yeah, so I think the first part that became a lot more obvious over time is actually value. And again, it sounds like the cheesiest thing. And I remember when I started Kartuku, I asked my father, when, in his own entrepreneurial journey, he said, okay, when you're hiring somebody, what do you look for? And he told me point blank, he said, values. And I laughed. I frankly laughed. I said, values, there's a poster on the wall. And I was this young punk, right? And over time, I think you start to realize that, in good times, everybody will be along for the ride, right? But when you go through bad times, the people that really stay connected are the ones that have that common shared, belief in your vision and your mission, but more importantly about where you're going is how you get there. And that's values, right? And how you treat each other. And that to me is the stickiness that makes a company resilient. It really comes down to that common bond and that level of trust that's built. So I would say that's something that we've emphasized a lot more this time around. I think what has changed is Kartuku, was when we looked at sometimes when you're building a business, you may not see some of the inherent limitations of a business model, right? And a lot of the way you think about growth can be about, oh, it's about product market fit or, scalability. And in fact, for me, especially, inspired by blitzscaling, and in fact, those are two growth limiters. They're not the growth drivers. And the growth drivers are really about your, of course, market size, right? But one of the main things is really about your distribution. And the distribution at Kartuku was a lot more challenging because there's a lot of physical components, and the go-to-market was very hard. Um, Not to say that Vida's go-to-market isn't hard; it's definitely hard still. But at the same time, shipping software versus shipping physical machines around the country, hundreds of thousands of them, and thinking about the logistics element is a totally different element. So I think when it comes to some of the aspects of the business model design are fundamentally a lot different, and learning from, lessons of where some constraints and scaling came from and where some challenges, and how we can sort of think about and innovate, not just from a product technology point of view, but really from a business model and thinking about a lot more explicitly on distribution. I think that's really important, and beyond distribution. And part of distribution is really thinking about interoperability uh, and standards, because that actually, helps you think about hooking into ecosystems and thinking a lot more explicitly about partnerships, and that we won't do this alone. We are definitely all about having as much partnerships as we are, and defining the things that we won't do, and defining the different evolution of products in the right time. I think those are a lot of lessons learned of things that we've changed that may not be getting it perfectly, but hopefully not making as many of the same mistakes as we made before.
Nice. This makes so much sense. Somebody else asked, so while Vida is solving for eKYC, but there are a lot of norms around eKYB as well, and those are probably less well defined than the eKYC norms around ultimate business ownership, AML norms. How do you think? How do you imagine the state of eKYB right now in Indonesia, and how do you see some of that changing? And will Vida be a part in that transformation on defining eKYB the way you have done for eKYC?
I think that's a great question. And, you know, eKYB really, for me, it's about abstracting to the next layer, and connecting not only an individual identity, but obviously a corporate or legal identity, an institutional identity. But ultimately, within that institutional identity are individual identities. So, the way we look at connecting the dots, it's just a next layer. It's the next layer beyond. And today, you could argue that, whether it's driver onboarding or merchant onboarding, those are businesses. And, they're small businesses, so they tend to just be more of just a personal ID rather than, a corporate relationship and ID. But fundamentally, I think once we sort of connect the dots with what is the business, and ideally understanding who are the authorized personnel of that business, and then connecting those dots, Those are capabilities we already have at Vida, actually. I think the question is, when do we operationalize that product? Because when is the right time? Because it comes down to when will we be able to launch that product in a scalable way. So for us, is that part of our roadmap? 100%. Is it where we're focusing right now? Sort of. I would say not explicitly. I think our Vida's sort of identity verification superpower is really about consumer verification or individuals and being able to do that at mass and at scale from, the simplicity of a low end smartphone in a tier 3 city with limited network bandwidth. Those are the problems that we're solving for today. Those skills, we do believe, are going to be vital to being able to onboard businesses. And in fact, we already are. So drivers, merchants, we're already doing quite a bit of that. Now, are we doing it all the way to an AML level? There are certain parts that our clients will take on, and they may have other partners to solve those pieces. But I guess, for us, it's about, again, where is our superpower? Where is our unique selling point? And how do we stay focused on delivering that core value?
Thanks. This is super clear. Again, I can't stress enough that how clear you are about what you want to do and what you don't want to do. It's again and again in your different messaging very very clear, and you've defined very clear boundaries. I'm sure you must have a hard time deciding this and kind of sticking to it. It's so easy to get slide away and do something else as well. But the clarity is super infectious.
Well, and that's where it comes down to writing it down and
Fair
having it
enough.
and revisiting it again and again and again. And it will evolve, right? The information, the understanding of your nuances of the market, being able to work with more and more customers will help continue to tune that.
Right.
But yeah, I think it all starts with having that vision, right? And strongly, you have a strong vision, but loosely held, right? You got to be
Yeah.
able to adapt
Yes.
along
Yes.
the way.
Nice.
Strong beliefs, loosely held, right? So
Correct. Correct.
you got to be, understanding how do we adapt and how do we, at the end of the day, make it work in detail for our customers. And frankly, because we're B2B2C, it's our customer's customer.
Correct. 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 Nice. Nice. Cool. Given that we are solving for fintech as an industry and we're talking to middle managers, builders, and operators, what is that one advice you give to your team members or people who come to seek for your advice? It can be generic for individuals and young people also. It can be in context of fintech. But what's an advice or that you keep coming back to when somebody seeks you for mentorship?
Well, I think finding a what exactly they want to be mentored for. But I think being able to take the big picture view. I always, you can always use ikigai as a framework of, what are you good at, what do you get paid for, are relatively
Right.
easy things to define, and what are you passionate about, what do you love is also fairly easy to define. The hardest part is how do you overlay all of that together and then combine that with what the world needs. That is the starting point to help drive your own personal journey and understand that underlying motivation of where you want to be for yourself. And for me, it's sort of a little jigsaw puzzle of, okay, now I know what value you want,
Hmm.
what you need to get there. And for me, it's always about a take and give. Like, what can I help you with?
Right.
What can I help you? How can I help you achieve that goal? Because ultimately, only then will you be really motivated and engaged, because you're not doing it because someone told you. It's because you fundamentally believe that's in your own best interest. And I think that finding that alignment is always critical and very difficult. It takes a bit of introspection and it takes a bit of self-awareness and honesty with yourself. But ultimately, I think being able to go through that with an open mind and explicit about charting a path, even though you may change paths, but pick a path, right?
Correct.
And give it a shot, right? And give it a shot. Not don't keep changing it, right? Have that one idea of where you want to go. For me, finding that blend is really that intersection is what's critical to unlocking somebody's true potential.
You seem to be someone who's very, very well read. You talked about build it in this conversation. You talk about crossing the chasm. Is there a book that you feel you have kind of gifted to, or you feel that young people again? I mean, one book that you would advise younger people to read, or maybe 2 or 3 books or articles for that matter, which you keep going back to or you keep recommending to people?
I think different books for different purposes, right? And anyone who's a founder, I think I reread Zero to One so many times
Right.
to really craft about knowing when I was ready to start.
Hmm.
And there were 7 questions, right? And it's really brilliantly put together. And being able to answer all of those 7 questions really well, I think is very helpful. So for founders, I'd say Zero to One.
Hmm.
And as you are on a different journey as a management team, thinking about scaling, obviously blitz scaling is an obvious one as well.
Right.
The one that I really love recently is Build,
Yep.
because for anyone who is in product or
Yes.
design, it's just refreshing how practical
Correct.
and simple,
Yep.
but nuanced.
Right.
No, it is. So I personally love those. I think once, if you're, depending on the business, if you're thinking about adoption journeys, there's 7 pillars of customer success, and thinking about a lot of these different aspects of, from onboarding to adoption to retention, and thinking about that whole journey of how you can get one of your customers, all the way to being an advocate and championing for you, and especially if you're in a B2B SaaS business, or any SaaS business for that matter, I'd say it is going to be a bit more compelling. So those are some of the books, but I love, some are very refreshing when you need a bit of a mental offload. Hard thing about hard things is,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yep.
Very entertaining, and very much you can kind of empathize, and like, yes, there's somebody else out there that feels my pain.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. They hit you hard. Yes.
So I don't know. There's quite a few books, but I think those are some of my favorites.
Nice. Thanks, Nikki. If people have to reach out to you, is there a place where they can reach out to you? Are you accessible on LinkedIn, Twitter?
Yep,
What's the
LinkedIn.
best way? LinkedIn.
LinkedIn's probably the easiest way.
Got it. Thanks, Nikki. This was exciting. I mean, from understanding very hardcore topics about identity verification, authentication, to moving to cheesy topics like values, to talking about perks and mentorship. It was really, really fascinating for us. And thank you so much for spending this time for talking to our users as well. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nihit.